My background really is from sculpture. I studied at the Munich Academy of Arts and came in there as a ceramicist. And then I started building objects. So I came with this background of being a person who builds things. Especially at the beginning, when I started with photography, I was very, very interested in making works that somewhat represent the uncanny or allow for a certain uncertainty when seeing the image. I'm not interested in making pretty pictures, and I'm not interested in making a straightforward document, but I am interested in putting the viewer somewhat at the edge. And since I'm always the first viewer and I'm the one who comes up with the idea of the piece, that's the state I'm looking for to be in when I make work. The camera obscura was just basically an incredible fascination. After having built my first one and having really seen the projected image inside, it's beautiful to see how the outside world comes into that camera space. And in a second step, seeing what is possible in how that slow process onto large sheets of photographs affects the image I make, that's just become a big fascination. The camera obscura is nothing other than a dark room. That's what the Latin expression means, dark room. And the dark room has a small hole, often called a pinhole or a lens, on one side, and through that hole, which is no other than a lens in a camera, an image projects itself onto the inside, onto the opposite wall of that lens, upside down and reversed. And depending on how large that opposite wall is and how large your camera room is, you have images that are enormous, that fill the entire space. My photographs often have exposure times of more than 1 day. The longest exposure I've recently done is 7 months. And it simply takes that much time for the light to travel from the lens onto the photographic paper and do enough of that to leave an imprint, a light imprint on the photographic emulsion. During the shorter exposures, I'm always in the camera. Anything up to 1 day, let's say 12 hours, I spend inside the camera. I observe the exposure, I manipulate it, I make sure everything goes well. For longer exposures, I enter and exit the camera and we check them regularly. So it's a little bit like having a pet. Despite of the long exposures and the slowness of the process, I can actually show movement and document change. Conventional photographers have often photographed many negatives and then they pick their favorite. I have to do all that editing and thinking prior to be really certain to not put my efforts into an image that I will then at the end not feel satisfied with. In those instances where I can't locate a room, I have to build a house, a little room, a cabin that will substitute as my camera. When the image has seen the exposure time that I've determined I need, I will take the photographic paper down and develop it myself with my coworkers here in the studio in my own darkroom. I think a certain form of stillness simply transpires in my work. The time brings about a certain calm in the image. Anything that moves quickly will disappear. Since we're sitting in New York City, everything in New York at least tries to move quickly. So photographing the streets of New York and having them kind of empty of people and empty of movement, in a way gives the beauty of the city back to the viewer, because often we can't see anything because there's so much going on. Our eyes can't rest on something. Scale is very important. I wanted absolutely to enable the viewer to experience what I experience inside the camera obscura. So there's a relationship of scale from viewer to room to image that is essential. I also want there to be this clear architectural relationship between the camera that produced the image and the image that comes out of it. And since the camera obscura is a room-sized camera, the image reflects that. The image I'm aiming for has to have a foot in two worlds. The world of the known and the world of the unknown. So I'm looking for a sort of kind of meta image that this negative, reversed, unique print is that I'm making, that gives away enough of the world that we know, but disguises it or represents this known world in a way that's just so far off our comfort zone that we're triggered to look more carefully, that the viewer is invited to double check on what she or he is seeing and what she or he might be expecting to see. It also has to do now with the conversion of color to black and white. That's often a reduction to essential form in what we're looking at. Abstracting, but also clarifying. By minimizing, there's a certain process of clarification, I think. I love black and white, and I think often simply by taking color out, there's a certain harmony that happens. Because form is reduced to its skeleton and shadows become light, there's a lightness and a beauty that comes to things that we really don't consider beautiful conventionally. And I very much appreciate that in my process. I very much enjoy looking at things that aren't, in the conventional bag of beautiful. With the light shadows that always lift everything off the ground that otherwise would be heavy and clunky. I like to think that many of these vistas have become in ways more beautiful than we think they are when we look at them in person. Memory is, of course, an incredibly important part of my work, and I'm learning about that myself. The element of time is always related to memory, and the element of the uncanny, of the unexpected and surprising is deeply related to our memory, because memory is never a clear-cut objective image or narrative. So we all create these visions of memory in our mind. And I think the alteration that my images experience in the process of my making them allow the viewer, allow us to engage with our own memory when we see them. Frankfurt Airport, the opportunity to work in an airport, I sought out in the context of a larger project that is about travel and voyage, transition, change. And it had a lot to do with my having arrived in America and examining the expense of time and travel that I had to do between the old continent and the new continent. And that sort of arc of the whale coming up for air and going down between Europe and America, if you wish, also entails, of course, of all the differences that one socially and culturally experiences, not to mention language. So for me, there was a lot of beautiful new world, but also a lot of challenging change. And the idea was also my thinking about these vessels that enable transportation. If you think of a ship, the whole belly of the ship is an empty vessel. And its purpose is to take in cargo or people and move them from one place to the other. The same is true for a train or for a plane. It's pretty simple, But I liked to set that in an analogy to my camera, which is this empty vessel, and it transports light. It takes in light and transports it, enables it into an image. And it became a very important project for me because it allowed me to give evidence to so many different aspects in my work. That is movement, that is the very, very common view of an airplane, but suddenly turned around and portrayed differently, and therefore it wakens up our senses in different ways. Film is very important in my work, and I think about it a lot because if you think of Andy Warhol's piece 24-Hour Empire State Building, he kind of does very much what I do, but to a completely different end. In his 24-hour observation or in his sleep films, he holds the camera still onto one, I mean, he crops the world into one frame, but the negatives keep running over all that time. And I'm in many ways doing the exact same thing, but my negative is only one. So that practically brings in a lot of aspects of film that in the end aren't immediately evident in the work, but that are part of the process and part of its sort of inheritance, if I wish. The LACMA project is an incredible gift and opportunity for me. Michael Gavin and I worked together here in New York City when he was the director of the Dia Center of the Arts. And he and the curator Lynn Cook invited me to work with them and produce a show. And then Michael left New York and moved to Los Angeles to become the director of LACMA. Many years went by. And then I had started to take interest in photographing other artists' work, which I've been doing since 2012. And I had the opportunity on smaller scales to work at the Metropolitan Museum, at the National Gallery of Art, and was invited to be part of a project, the Museum of Modern Art. So I had opportunities to develop a certain language working inside and around art. And after having done that, I felt ready to do this on a large scale. My dream image, the image for which I called Michael, was wanting to photograph the interior of an old master's gallery. He said, but I want more and we have to do more, and you shouldn't only document the interior of our galleries, but you should also photograph the museum from the outside. We're approaching changes here and I would like this documented in your artistic way before the day comes that we might not be able to see it anymore. There were many surprises of enormous challenges, including craning the camera onto a bridge to make an image of a certain overview of that assembly of different buildings, that very particular strange and surprising view of LACMA that will go away when they make the changes they're proposing. I was very, very curious about the idea of photographing old and contemporary art with my technique. But I was also very concerned about making sure that I'm not trying to look like I'm adding something to the work that it doesn't already possess. So my attempt was, and I think in many cases I was able to be successful with that, is to photograph the work and again, return it to its skeleton, return it to its roots, and appreciate everything that the painter may have done, but bring it out in a different form so that we can see it newly and that we can see it differently and that we want to go back to the painting and see it again in its original form. One of the first pieces that I photographed at LACMA is a 15th century piece, The Death of Lucretia by Mazzanti. And I intuitively chose that piece. But this piece fascinated me, and I wanted to bring it into the black and white negative form. And after I developed it and we looked at it, curator and director and I all together, we found that the formal aspects of the piece were so clearly rendered in my black and white negative image that the woman that in the original painting is the dying Lucretia, in my photograph, we see that she really follows the formal aspects of an ascension. And that was very, very interesting for all of us. The element of chance in my work is something that I learned by surprise and by observation. Indeed, I never know what really happens. Will the sun shine? Will it rain? Will the truck stay there? Will it pull out? That's immensely challenging, because if I can incorporate these changes into my photographs in a way that they're documented, it makes the image in my eyes so much richer and more mysterious. But it's a very, very careful choreography that I have to execute inside the camera, and that I also simply have to accept as to what happens and what doesn't happen. And I never can't be entirely certain of the image I'm making until I see it myself.